great paradox was that the truest knights of Christ were not those who died on a Saracen blade in the Holy Land, but the three wretches now tied to stakes in the mud of a Paris square, condemned not for treason or avarice, but for loving God's true nature too deeply. The stench of wet straw and unwashed bodies hung thick in the cold October air of 1298. Rain had ceased an hour past, leaving the cobblestones slick and mirroring the flickering torches. 5 years. It had been 5 years since the Grand Master himself had signed the papers exiling Sir Kaelen de la Tour, master of the Order's occult library and suspected purveyor of esoteric nonsense, from the rolls of the Knights Templar. Kaelen had spent those years watching the decay from the shadows, an invisible, cynical historian, but nothing had prepared him for the sight before him. The three condemned men, one former seneschal, one a librarian, and one simple field commander, were not fighters. They were thinkers. Their crimes, as publicly read by the king's crier, included denial of the Trinity, idolatrous kissing of unholy figures, and the silent worship of a Gnostic lie. Lies, all of them, manufactured to justify the systematic, cold-blooded purge. The real crime was that these men still believed in the Order's forbidden codes, a body of secret philosophical and spiritual doctrine that placed personal enlightenment and direct mystical experience above the papal decree and the king's political machinations. Kaelen stood in the deep archway of a tannery, the hood of his mud-stained traveler's cloak drawn low. His former brother, Guillaume, was on the central stake, his head bowed, not in defeat, but in a quiet, disturbing resignation. Guillaume had once saved Kaelen's life during a raid near Tyre, and now Kaelen could do nothing but watch him die on a pyre built by his own order. The irony was a bitter, metallic taste in Kaelen's mouth. The Templars, the king's private bankers, and God's own iron fist were destroying their own soul for the sake of political purity and, worse, land and gold. A figure of dark, oppressive authority mounted the platform beside the stakes, Sir Varic de St. Clair, the newly installed Grand Master, and a man Kaelen knew to be nothing more than King Philip IV's well-dressed executioner. Varic wore the Order's white mantle, but it seemed to Kaelen to be soiled by the promise of blood money. "Brothers, people of Paris!" Varic's voice boomed, amplified by the sudden, terrifying silence of the crowd. "Today we excise a rot from the heart of Christ's army. These men, once honored, chose to soil the sacred mission. They followed the whisper of the Serpent, the old pagan lie of Gnostics. They sought to erase the line between the divine and the human, turning their hearts from humility to blasphemous pride." Kaelen's hand gripped the iron pommel of the short sword hidden beneath his cloak. The Serpent, the Gnostics. Varic knew exactly which nerve to touch. The forbidden codes were a complex tapestry of Neoplatonic, early Christian Gnostic, and Sufi influences the first Templars had gathered in the East, a quest for direct, unmediated knowledge of the divine, a philosophy that rendered the Church's mediation irrelevant. It was a truth too dangerous for the medieval world, and it was exactly what Philip IV was using as a pretext to confiscate the vast wealth and land of the entire order. Varic finished his speech with a theatrical wave of his hand. "Let the fire purge the heresy. Let their ash remind all that the only path to salvation is through obedience." The torch was applied. The straw caught with a hiss and a roar. Guillaume did not cry out. He raised his head and locked eyes with Kaelen, somehow, impossibly, cutting through the vast, surging crowd and the smoke. In that final, desperate moment, Kaelen saw not fear, but a flicker of a silent, urgent message, a movement of the eyes towards the south, a silent plea. Kaelen felt the shock wave hit him, not the heat, but the cold, paralyzing clarity of absolute certainty. The purge was not just about the gold, it was about total annihilation of the idea. The men on the pyre were the physical evidence, but the true prize were the forbidden codes themselves, now scattered in hidden caches across Europe and the Levant. Varric and Philip IV would not stop until every scroll, every cipher, and every living mind that knew the true Gnostic core of the order was extinguished. It has to be preserved. Kaelen's cynicism dissolved into a steel-hard resolve. He was a disgraced heretic, an exiled scholar, and a man who had chosen inaction for 5 years, believing the institution would somehow save itself. Now he was witnessing the Order's spirit being burned alive in a French square. He turned and melted into the crowd, pushing through the stunned silence and the sudden, awful wailing of the condemned men. The execution was the inciting incident. The silence he had kept for 5 years was now a suffocating lie he could no longer bear. He had to honor Guillaume's final silent message. Kaelen knew the codes were not kept in a single book, but in a network of caches, ciphers, and loyal minds, a network he had helped build and now needed to resurrect. He was the keeper of the first secret, the master of the library's occult keys. He reached the outskirts of the square, the stench of burning flesh now a permanent acrid memory. The world had just changed. He was no longer a cynical observer. He was the last best hope of the Templar's spiritual heart. He had to go south, following Guillaume's final direction. He had to find the first key, a relic of immense power and dangerous knowledge he had not touched in years, the Serpent's seal, hidden near the old Mediterranean coast. His life of quiet solitude was over. He was an enemy of the crown, an enemy of the church, and most bitterly, an enemy of the very order he was trying to save. His immediate, most pressing fear was not King Philip's spies, but the brutal, efficient executioners in white mantles, his former brethren, now led by Varric, who would know exactly what Kaelen stood for and exactly where he might run. The Forbidden Knight had returned to the game. He pulled his hood tighter, his face a granite mask of cold determination, and headed for the southern road, the roaring of the fire a grim promise of the path ahead. He would preserve the codes, or he would join Guillaume's ashes. There was no third way. The road south from Paris was a gauntlet of shadows, not cast by the late autumn sun, but by the king's ubiquitous network. Kaelen traveled not as a knight, but as a silent, invisible man, a scholar wrapped in cheap wool, his eyes constantly scanning the tree lines and the taverns for the sight of a white mantle. He rode an undersized, unremarkable mare purchased with the last of his gold, moving with a desperate 2-day urgency toward the coastal town of Narbonne. It was there, in a secluded monastery cell 5 years ago, that he had entrusted the most dangerous object he possessed to the only man he still trusted, an elderly, half-mad former Benedictine cartographer named Father Alaric. Alaric, despite his clerical robes, was one of the last true Gnostics in the South. He understood that the preservation of the codes was paramount to the preservation of true knowledge itself. Guillaume's dying gaze had pointed south for a reason, confirming Kaelen's instinct. The time to activate the Serpent seal was now. When Kaelen finally reached Narbonne on the 4th day, the air was warmer, salty, and thick with the scent of Mediterranean citrus, a stark contrast to the Parisian stench of blood and ash. He rode directly to the isolated Abbey of St. Jude, built into the high cliffs overlooking the bay. He found the abbey gates sealed and the main courtyard disturbingly empty. The silence here was not peaceful. It was a hungry absence. Kaelen dismounted, pulling his dagger. The scent of wood smoke was fresh, but there were no monks in sight. He forced the side door, a fragile oak that yielded with a groan, and slipped inside. The library was Kaelen's objective. It had been Alaric's sanctum, filled with maps and astronomical charts. When Kaelen arrived, the room was in ruins. Scrolls lay torn, astronomical brass instruments were smashed, and the central table was overturned. The purge had already arrived. Then Kaelen saw him. Father Alaric was slumped against a bookshelf, his face pale and slick with sweat, a dark, ragged stain spreading across his habit above his kidney.
His eyes, however, held a terrifying lucidity. He had been stabbed, not by a clumsy thief, but by a precise, trained hand, the kind Kaelen knew all too well belonged to a Templar assassin. "Kaelen," Alaric whispered, his voice thin as brittle parchment. "The fire! I saw it in the smoke." Kaelen knelt quickly, tearing cloth from his cloak to press against the wound, but he knew it was futile. The elderly man was draining quickly. "Who did this? Varric? Did they find the seal?" Alaric coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "Not Varric. Worse, a knight of the Black Cross. They knew what to look for, but they were too slow. I gave them only the common things, the true seal." He trailed off, his gaze locking on a specific empty niche in the wall, one where a statue of the patron saint once stood. Kaelen followed his eyes. "Tell me, Alaric, where?" "The map, behind the Agnus Dei," Alaric gasped, his hand weakly pointing to a large faded fresco on the ceiling, depicting a lamb. "They erased the codes from the books, Kaelen, but they cannot erase the place." With a sudden final surge of strength that seemed impossible for a man so near death, Alaric reached into his own tunic and pulled out a small, intricately carved box, no larger than a man's palm, made of polished serpentine wood. It was sealed with a single complex knot of gold wire. "The Serpent seal," Kaelen murmured, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm. This was the master key, the first lock in a long chain. Inside this box lay the initial cipher that unlocked the entire scattered doctrine, the forbidden philosophical and ritual core that the Order had sought to destroy. "The journal is inside," Alaric wheezed, placing the box in Kaelen's trembling hand. "It tells you where the libraries are, the true sanctuaries. You must not attempt to read the philosophy first. Read the geography. Preserve the places, Kaelen. The ideas will follow." Alaric's eyes rolled back and his body went slack against the wood. Kaelen closed the dead man's eyelids, his own face grim. The Templar purge was not a slow-moving political tide. It was a fast, vicious extermination. He quickly searched the niche Alaric had pointed to. Behind the missing statue base, Kaelen found a loose stone. He pulled it free to reveal a tightly rolled waxed canvas, a map, not a map of Europe, but a schematic of the Templars' earliest holdings, marked with cryptic astronomical symbols instead of names. It was the geographic cipher. Kaelen took the map and the Serpent's seal box. The killers would be back, or they would report their failure to Varric. He had barely a day's head start. As he prepared to leave, Kaelen paused by Alaric's body. The old man was right. The Templars' codes were dangerous not because they suggested alternative forms of worship, but because they suggested that the divine light was a property of human consciousness, making kings and popes irrelevant to salvation. That was the core principle Philip IV wished to erase from the annals of history. He left the abbey under the growing darkness, the serpent seal warm against his chest. He rode away from the coast, turning his thoughts to the arduous, dangerous task ahead. He needed allies. A mission this vast, against the combined might of crown and corrupted church, could not be undertaken alone. He needed someone who knew the old world, the hidden roots, and the true meaning of loyalty. He needed a former brother who had suffered a similar fate. Kaelen thought of a disgraced hospitaller, a man expelled for insolence and insubordination, living rough near the Spanish March, a man who hated the new Grand Masters even more than Kaelen did. The journey to the coast was a chase. The journey to find an ally would be a desperate plea. The preservation of the codes began now, and it would start with a desperate partnership built on shared exile and mutual hatred.
Narbonne was already too hot. Kaelen had spent a single night in a filthy roadside inn, deciphering the serpentine knot that held the seal closed. It was a complex, interlocking cipher based on the Fibonacci sequence, a mathematical puzzle designed to confound any casual thief, but elementary to Kaelen, the former master of the Order's esoteric library. When the wooden box finally clicked open, it revealed two things: a polished obsidian disc carved with the figure of a winged serpent eating its own tail, the true serpent's seal,
and a small, water-stained leather journal bound in faded indigo. The journal was the prize. It contained the complete coded indices of the forbidden codes, listing not the content but the location of every major cache, hidden libraries in ancient Roman ruins, scrolls sealed in Coptic monasteries, and, most crucially, the geographical key to the Order's final sanctuary. The language was a trilateral cipher mixing Greek, Hebrew, and Latin, known only to a handful of Templar scholars, a language Kaelen himself had helped create. But before acting on the map, Kaelen needed to understand the scope of his enemy. He had to confirm that Sir Varric was truly the king's puppet, and that the purge was rooted in political greed, not genuine theological zealotry. The road led north again, but this time to the Viper Pit itself, Paris and the court of King Philip IV, known to history and his detractors as Philip the Fair, a name Kaelen found bitterly ironic. Traveling under the assumed identity of a retired Flemish spice merchant, Kaelen arrived in Paris a week later. The city's mood was heavy, saturated with the fear left by the recent executions. The royal palace, the Louvre, stood as a monument to Philip's cold, absolute power. Kaelen used a few remaining contacts, a disaffected chronicler, a timid goldsmith, to gain access to the periphery of the court. He spent his days in the shadowed galleries and his nights listening in the smoky conspiratorial taverns that bordered the royal mint, the very place Templar funds were being systematically inventoried and seized. What he witnessed was not religious reform, but state-sponsored theft. Philip the Fair was a man consumed by debt and a pathological desire for centralized power. He watched him from a distance, a tall, eerily handsome man whose face was utterly devoid of empathy, his eyes calculating the net worth of every man who bowed before him. The purge of the Templars was simply his most audacious, most lucrative policy. But the most damning confirmation came from observing the new Grand Master. Kaelen saw Varric de St. Clair not in the Templar compound, which was now being guarded by royal troops, but frequently inside the Louvre itself, acting less like a spiritual leader and more like a high-ranking royal treasurer. One afternoon, Kaelen stood concealed in the King's Chapel balcony, watching a private meeting take place below. Only 3 men were present: King Philip, his chief minister Guillaume de Nogaret, the architect of the legal framework for the heresy charges, and Sir Varric. Varric was not supplicating to the king, he was reporting. "The first stage of confiscation is complete, Your Majesty," Varric reported, his voice crisp and devoid of the righteous fury he used at the pyre. "The gold is secondary to the ideas, Varric. You must not forget the purpose of your appointment. The Templar philosophy is a cancer that preaches autonomy of the soul. It makes the common man question the divine right of kings. I want the codes, Varric. I want every heretical scroll burned, every master cipher destroyed. I want the memory of the Gnosis extinguished." Varric inclined his head. "The eradication is underway, sire. The Black Cross unit, the internal Inquisition, is tracking the known sympathizers. I believe we have already frightened the chief architect of the codes, the one we call Latour, Kaelen. He fled years ago, but he remains the greatest threat to their survival. He knows where the deepest caches lie." A cold thread of terror and grim satisfaction ran through Kaelen. He was indeed the center of Varric's hunt. The purge was a 2-pronged attack, one for the gold, one for the philosophy. Varric, a new Grand Master, was actively hunting the codes he pretended to uphold. The Templar Order itself was now the ultimate betrayal. Kaelen slipped away, his purpose now crystal clear and his options narrowed to a single dangerous path. He could not save the Order, only the codes.
To preserve the knowledge, he had to become a master thief, stealing the true heart of the Templars out from under the king's nose. The immediate goal, revealed by the Serpent's seal journal, was a major cache hidden on the Spanish March, a place called Castellum Nigrum. But traveling alone was impossible. Varric's Black Cross unit would be watching all the southern roads. Kaelen needed a sword, a shield, and a scout, someone who knew the hidden trails and cared nothing for kings, popes, or even the Templar order. He needed a man of pure, simple, visceral loyalty. He thought of the only other disgraced man he knew who had once sworn allegiance to a principle, not a crown. Sir Gareth, the disgraced Hospitaller, rumored to be rustling cattle near the Pyrenees. Kaelen had to find Gareth, and fast. The game had truly begun.
Kaelen spent another week riding west and south, towards the jagged teeth of the Pyrenees. The indigo journal, secured inside his tunic, felt less like a relic of sacred truth and more like a warrant for his death. The next cache, Castellum Niger, was deep in the lawless terrain near the Spanish border, accessible only by a man who knew the mountain passes better than the king's tax collector knew his ledger. That man was Sir Gareth. Gareth, a former Knight Hospitaller, had been cashiered from his order for an act of spectacular, drunken insubordination against a superior officer who had needlessly ordered a retreat during a crucial skirmish in the Levant. Unlike Kaelen, who was banished for heresy of the mind, Gareth was banished for heresy of the spirit, refusing to follow an order he deemed cowardly. He was a brute, a drinker, and an absolute master of irregular warfare. Kaelen found him 3 days' ride north of a small fortified village on the French side of the march, living in a dilapidated shepherd's croft. Gareth wasn't rustling cattle, he was raising goats and running protection for local merchants against the genuine brigands. A simple, pragmatic survival. Kaelen approached the croft at dusk, keeping his hand near the short sword. He saw Gareth first, a massive man with a rust-red beard streaked with gray, chopping firewood with the rhythmic, powerful efficiency of a siege weapon. He wore no order colors, only rough leather and homespun, but the sheer size of the man and the memory of his raw, unfiltered fighting style were enough to confirm his identity. As Kaelen stepped from the shadows, Gareth did not flinch or pause the blade's descent. He simply let the blade bite deep into the log, then stood, turning slowly. His eyes, pale, keen, and permanently narrowed, took in Kaelen's cheap cloak and scholar's pallor. "You look like a man who owes money to a monastery," Gareth observed, his voice a low, gravelly baritone, untouched by surprise. "Worse, I look like a man who used to run the monastery's library," Kaelen replied, pulling back his hood just enough to reveal the scar above his brow, a mark he'd received 5 years prior, the night of his banishment. He squinted. Then recognition, hard and cold, flashed in his eyes. "Latour, the Templar. I heard you went to ground. I heard they finally porched some of your bookish friends in Paris. Sad business. The king has grown greedy." Kaelen stepped closer, ignoring the casual assessment of his loss. "They burned Guillaume, Gareth, and they burned the others not for gold but for the Gnosis, for the truth they girded. Varric is Philip's dog, and he's using the Templar's internal assets, the Black Cross, to eradicate the Order's spiritual core." Gareth spat into the dust. "Varric is a fool. Philip is a tyrant. This is no news, Kaelen. It is simply the nature of power. It consumes itself. I am done with orders and codes. I have goats and clean wine." "The codes are not about allegiance, Gareth. They are about truth," Kaelen pressed, reaching inside his tunic and pulling out the Serpent seal box, the serpentine wood gleaming faintly in the last light. The Templar was not just an army or a bank. It was a school. What they are burning are not men, but knowledge, a secret philosophical history that predates the church and renders Philip's tyranny moot. Gareth's focus sharpened, fixing on the obsidian seal. He stepped forward, his eyes no longer casual. "What is that?" "The key."
This box holds the cipher to the network, the hidden libraries, the scrolls, the complete forbidden spiritual codes of the old orders. Philip wants them destroyed. Varric's Black Cross unit is already scouring the coast, hunting the men who held the first key, like Father Alaric. Alaric is dead, killed in Narbonne 3 days ago by a Black Cross blade. Kaelen let the weight of that fact settle. I am going to save the codes. I am going to steal them out of the hands of Varric and the king and entrust them to men who value philosophy over power. I need a guide, a shield, and a sword. The first cache, Castellum Niger, is across the march. It's too dangerous for a lone scholar. Gareth walked past him, retrieved his axe, and slammed it back into the chopping block. He took a long, thoughtful breath of the mountain air. I despise the Templar order for their avarice and their arrogance. I despise the Hospitallers for their cowardice. I despise the king for his debt. You ask me to step into the exact path of the most powerful, most ruthless network of assassins in Europe, all for a stack of old scrolls. I am asking you to fight for a principle, Gareth, the only principle left worth fighting for, the right of a man to know God on his own terms. You can keep your goats, or you can pick up a sword again and fight a shadow war that actually matters. Gareth stood silent for a full minute with his back to Kaelen, the weight of the axe and the mountain stillness heavy between them. Finally, he turned, a grim, wolfish smile touching his scarred face. I hate Varric, he admitted, the raw, undeniable truth in his voice. He ordered the charge that cost me my knighthood. I will not die for a book, Kaelen, but I will help you bury that little snake Varric, and if a few priceless scrolls are saved along the way, I suppose it's a bonus. He retrieved a massive two-handed sword from the back of the croft. Castellum Niger, you say. It's a ruin, high above the pass. They won't expect anyone to go through the mountains. They will only watch the roads. But a man does not survive in these hills for 5 years without having friends and debts. We'll ride by morning. You may know the ciphers, Kaelen, but I know the shadows. Now tell me what this Gnostic lie actually says, and if it's worth dying for. Kaelen nodded, a tight knot in his stomach easing for the first time since Paris. He had his ally. It says, Gareth, that there is no heaven but the knowledge you hold in your own heart. And if they erase that, then all is hell. Gareth chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. Then let us ensure we don't end up back in France, because hell smells like burned straw and false promises. We ride at dawn. The old guard was recruited, ready to face the king's shadow. The journey across the Spanish March was a brutal initiation into the Shadow War. Gareth, true to his word, proved to be an indispensable guide. He moved Kaelen through the high mountain passes like a phantom, avoiding not only the Royal Guard checkpoints, but also the predatory bands of mercenaries who haunted the borderlands. Kaelen, the scholar, learned quickly to sleep with one eye open, and the scent of pine and horse sweat replacing the old smell of parchment and ink. Castellum Niger was a crumbling Visigothic fortress perched on an impossible outcrop of rock, abandoned centuries ago. It was here, 2 weeks after leaving Narbonne, that Kaelen finally tested the true depth of the forbidden codes. The fortress's chapel floor, according to the Indigo Journal, contained a key cipher leading to the primary, geographically scattered caches. Working by the light of a single hooded lantern while Gareth stood guard, his massive sword, Insolence, resting against the wall, Kaelen located the specific paving stone mentioned in the journal. It bore a subtle carving, a circle crossed by an X, a symbol that had nothing to do with Christianity. It was an ancient Iberian rune for knowledge. Beneath the stone, sealed in a cavity, was a lead scroll case. Inside, Kaelen found what he sought, the cipher of Rhodes. It was not a philosophy or a doctrine, but a set of astronomical coordinates and nautical charts, cross-referenced with the old Templar supply routes. These charts pointed directly to the strategic islands and coastal cities that had served as the Order's economic backbone. Most notably, they pointed to the headquarters of the Knights Hospitaller on the island of Rhodes, which had secretly served as a massive offshore Templar archive after the fall of Acre. "Rhodes?" Gareth asked, reviewing the charts by the sputtering light. "We are going back east? Varric's Black Cross unit will expect us to run to the Iberian kingdoms, not back toward the Mediterranean." "Precisely," Kaelen confirmed, carefully tracing a line on the chart. "The codes state that the deepest and most dangerous secrets, the true Gnostic interpretations of Christ's teachings, were sealed in Rhodes and Smyrna. Varric is purging the Templars in France. He won't expect us to attempt a retrieval from the headquarters of a rival order. The Hospitallers will not welcome a disgraced Templar and a cashiered Hospitaller. They are not allies, Kaelen. They are opportunists, watching their former brothers burn while eyeing their assets." "The cipher suggests a weak point," Kaelen explained, pointing to a cryptic mark on the chart near the harbor of the main fortress, a subterranean depot used for transferring sensitive cargo and records between the two orders in the years before the fall of Acre. It's listed here as the Serpent's Coil. If the codes are there, they are guarded by Hospitaller soldiers who know nothing of the true contents. The decision was made. They sold their horses for passage on a fast, small merchant vessel out of Marseille, bound for the Levant. The journey was long and tense. Kaelen spent the weeks at sea translating more of the Indigo Journal, confirming his fears. The forbidden codes detailed not only a radical philosophy, but also the Templars' intimate, secret knowledge of pre-Christian mystery schools and occult practices, the very information Philip IV deemed a threat to the foundations of the Western Church. Rhodes was a fortified spectacle, the main harbor bristling with the lances and banners of the Hospitallers. Kaelen and Gareth posed as traveling Cypriot masons infiltrating the town near the fortress wall. Following the cipher of Rhodes, they located a discreet sealed wellhead hidden in a narrow, forgotten alleyway, its cover marked with the same subtle Iberian rune Kaelen had seen at Castellum Niger. They descended into the cold, saline darkness using a rope. The tunnel was damp and ancient, leading them directly into a vast carved-out chamber, the Serpent's Coil. This was not a typical military depot. The air was dry, and the space was filled with hundreds of sealed, lead-lined chests, the Order's most precious non-monetary archives. Kaelen scanned the chests, guided by the cipher's internal logic, and quickly identified 3 large chests bearing the mark of the Triple Crown, the Templars' esoteric sign for their most confidential philosophical material. As Kaelen was frantically trying to pry open the first chest, the sound of heavy boots echoed from the main entrance of the coil. They were not Hospitaller boots. They were the measured, disciplined tread of the Black Cross. "They knew it," Gareth hissed, drawing insolence with a scraping sound of steel on stone. Varric's Black Cross unit must have been watching the Castellum Niger cipher for years. The men who filled into the chamber wore Templar white, but their mantles were emblazoned with a striking, stylized black cross that Kaelen recognized as the official sigil of Varric's internal Inquisition. They were 6 in number, led by a lean, scarred master knight named Sir Silas, a man Kaelen recognized as a brutal disciplinarian promoted by Varric. "Kaelen de la Tour," Silas's voice sliced through the tension. "You were expected. Grand Master Varric sends your regards. He prefers the Gnostic lie to be burned in Rhodes, far from French soil. Surrender the chest." "You serve a thief, Silas," Kaelen yelled back, tearing open the chest lid. Inside he saw the scrolls, hundreds of them bound in red leather. "You are destroying the soul of the Order for a king's purse." "The soul of the Order is obedience," Silas roared, and the Black Cross Knights charged. The fight was instant, visceral chaos. Gareth, despite the numerical disadvantage, was a terrifying storm of steel, his 2-handed sword cutting a swathe through the knights.
Kaelen, primarily a scholar, was forced to defend himself with his short sword while desperately attempting to secure the precious scrolls. He managed to grab a handful of the oldest-looking parchments, the very foundation of the codes, just as Gareth's wild, desperate defense began to falter. With a final desperate shove, Gareth cleaved one of the knights, creating a momentary distraction. "The other way, Kaelen, now!" They scrambled back toward the entrance wellhead, leaving the heavy chests behind. The cipher of Rhodes was now compromised, its secrets revealed to Varric. Kaelen and Gareth escaped into the dark, wet tunnels, but the chilling truth had been revealed. Varric was not just purging the French order, he was systematically tracking and eliminating every hidden archive, making this a global race against time.
The escape from the Serpent's coil in Rhodes was a dizzying, panicked flight through the subterranean maze and out into the dark harbor. Kaelen and Gareth managed to commandeer a small, rigged-up fishing vessel, sacrificing the weight of the bulkier scrolls for speed. They sailed west, hugging the coastline of the islands, knowing that the Black Cross unit would have the entire region under surveillance within the day. The immediate crisis was the realization that Varric was ahead of them. The cipher of Rhodes was now compromised. The Black Cross unit must have interrogated a captive old master, forcing him to surrender the keys to the geographical network. Kaelen needed to change the entire game. Following the planned trail, Smyrna, Cyprus, Crete was suicide. Kaelen reviewed the indigo journal by the dim light of a hooded lantern. It spoke of a secondary, more secretive archive, a hidden library known only as the Labyrinth of the Word, said to be located near the ancient Roman ruins of Sicily. This cache was not listed in the main geographical cipher, but was known only through esoteric references to the teachings of Augustine and a specific passage from the book of Isaiah. Gareth, piloting the small boat with the brutal competence of a veteran, watched Kaelen trace the coded passages. "Stop reading theology and tell me where we are going, Templar," he demanded, his voice rough with exhaustion and adrenaline. "Sicily. A place called the Labyrinth of the Word. It holds the deepest philosophical secrets, the scrolls that detail the ritual practices," Kaelen explained. "They are too dangerous to be publicly listed. Varric might not know it exists." "It's a trap," Gareth stated flatly. "Varric's network is too deep. They tracked us to Rhodes. They'll track us to Sicily." Gareth's words proved prophetic sooner than either man desired. On the open water 3 days later, they were intercepted. It was not a Templar galley that cornered them, but a sleek, fast carrack flying the gold and red banner of the papacy. The men on board were not knights, but armed guards wearing the severe black and white robes of the Holy Inquisition. They were mercilessly efficient, boarding the small fishing boat and subduing Kaelen and Gareth with shocking speed. They were dragged onto the carrack and brought before the man who commanded the vessel, Father Tierney, an inquisitor renowned across southern Europe for his cold intellect and relentless pursuit of doctrinal purity. Tierney was a man of contrasts. His face was gaunt and severe, yet his eyes held a calculating intelligence that suggested he was driven more by intellectual curiosity than blind dogma. "Sir Kaelen de la Tour," said Tierney, gesturing to the indigo journal Kaelen had been forced to surrender. "I am pleased to finally meet the man who writes such elegantly phrased heresy. You are not a fool, Sir Knight. You are a philosopher, and philosophers, I find, are far more dangerous than bankers." "You serve the king's ambition, Father," Kaelen shot back, straining against his bonds. "This is not about heresy, it is about royal confiscation." Tierney laughed, a dry, unpleasant sound. "The king and I have a common interest in burning the weeds, Kaelen, but my interest extends beyond his purse. Philippe wants the Templar gold. I want the Templar knowledge, specifically the knowledge they stole from Byzantium, the true Gnostic and Hellenic texts, the texts that predate your silly knightly order." He gestured to the Serpent seal box and the journal on a table nearby.
I know this journal is the key to the archives, but I am an academic, not an assassin like Varric. I wish to read, not to burn." Tierney approached Kaelen, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The king and Varric have a prisoner in Paris, a scholar named Brother Elias, the last living man who can read the oldest Byzantine ciphers of the order. They are torturing him to reveal the location of the labyrinth of the word. They plan to execute him immediately once they have the location." Kaelen felt a cold dread. Elias was not merely a scholar, he was the primary translator of the early Gnostic texts, the man who held the master key to the meaning of the codes, not just their location. "Tierney, why are you telling me this?" Kaelen demanded. The Inquisitor leaned in, offering a chilling bargain. "I want the labyrinth. You want Elias saved. Varric is keeping Elias in a Templar holding cell near Marseille before transferring him to Paris. I have contacts in the city. Help me break Elias out of Varric's grasp. He dies anyway, so you lose nothing, and in exchange, I will give you a one-day lead and a piece of critical information, the specific hidden coordinates to the labyrinth. I want the knowledge. I will not burn it. I will simply claim it for the papacy's own archive. The codes are too valuable to be destroyed." Kaelen assessed the situation instantly. Tierney was an enemy, but Varric was a killer. Saving Elias meant saving the meaning of the codes. It was a perilous, cynical deal, but it offered a chance. "The coordinates for the labyrinth," Kaelen stated, "in advance. Only then will I trust you, Inquisitor." Tierney smiled, the look unsettlingly triumphant. He produced a small rolled-up piece of vellum and dropped it into Kaelen's lap. "A map of the coastline near Syracuse. The labyrinth is beneath a Roman cistern. Now, my newly recruited agent, you must travel back to Marseille. The convoy leaves in 3 days. Do not fail me." Kaelen had accepted the devil's bargain. They were put ashore near the Italian boot, the weight of the parchment and the life of Elias heavy in his hand. They were no longer simply fleeing Varric. They were now working for the Inquisition, forced to dive back into the very heart of the conflict.
The journey to the outskirts of Marseille was undertaken with a sick sense of urgency. Kaelen now wore the Papal Inquisitor's vellum map, detailing the location of the labyrinth of the word, secured beneath his belt. It was a physical testament to the dangerous transaction he had made, the life of Brother Elias for the knowledge held in Syracuse. The ethics were muddy, but the objective was clear: save the scholar to save the philosophical core of the codes. They arrived near the Marseille compound, an old Templar hospice now used as a temporary holding cell, under the cover of a dense mist rolling in from the coast. Gareth, despite his initial protestations, was driven by a visceral hatred for Varric and had fallen into the role of tactical commander with grim enthusiasm. "They will be moving him before dawn," Gareth whispered, crouched in the scrub brush overlooking the hospice's stable yard. "A Templar convoy moves fast and clean. We must strike before the horses are saddled." The target was Brother Elias, the last great translator of the Forbidden Codes, held captive by Varric's Black Cross. Kaelen and Gareth slipped past the perimeter wall, moving like shadows among the deserted outbuildings. The cell block was a fortified stone structure at the rear of the compound. They breached the back entrance silently, neutralizing a single drowsy sentry. Inside, the corridor was cold and reeked of stale straw and fear. Kaelen followed the sound of the ragged cough to a small, isolated cell. The sight of Elias made Kaelen's stomach turn. The scholar was chained to the wall, his thin body slumped, his clothes torn, and his face a road map of bruising and exhaustion. He was alive, but barely. "Elias," Kaelen whispered, fumbling with the cell's heavy iron lock. "It's Kaelen. We're getting you out." Elias lifted his head slowly, his eyes flickering with confusion, then recognition. "Latour,
They said you were burned or lost at sea. I am neither. We have little time. Varric is sending you to Paris. Kaelen finally forced the lock. As Kaelen was pulling Elias to his feet, a sudden blinding light erupted from the corridor entrance, not a torch, but the pure focused beam of a lantern, revealing the figures of 2 black-crossed knights blocking their escape. They were not patrol guards, they were executioners. "Too late, Kaelen," a cold voice echoed from the darkness behind the knights. It was Sir Silas, the master of the Black Cross unit from Rhodes. "We knew Inquisitor Tierney would be interested in Elias. We simply allowed him to track the poor fool to the location we wanted him found." It was a setup. Tierney hadn't been an ally. He had been a sophisticated decoy, used by Varric to draw Kaelen out into the open, confirming Varric's suspicion that Kaelen would prioritize the code's meaning over its geography. Silas stepped forward, drawing a long, clean dagger. "The location of the labyrinth was a perfect bait, Kaelen. You should have kept running. But now all the true keepers of the forbidden codes are gathered here, and they die here." Gareth roared and threw himself at the 2 knights, a thunderous distraction of steel. Kaelen, meanwhile, frantically secured Elias to his back, half carrying the frail scholar towards a small, broken ventilation shaft. "The labyrinth near Syracuse, the cistern, but the master key, it's not the scrolls, Kaelen, it's the scroll of the word itself. Varric knows it's the oldest text." Before Elias could say anything more, a sudden horrifying sound ripped through the air, a wet, choking gurgle. Sir Silas had moved with terrible speed, bypassing the fighting knights, and plunged his dagger deep into Elias's side. Elias slumped against Kaelen's back, a final shuddering breath escaping his lips. He was dead. Kaelen gently lowered the body, staring in numb disbelief at the betrayal. Varric had won this round. Gareth, seeing the slaughter, retreated towards Kaelen, his face a mask of rage. "No time. They have the courtyard secured. Run!" Kaelen seized the indigo journal and the Serpent seal. The price of the treacherous bargain was the life of the last translator. The tragedy was that Elias managed to deliver his message. The true objective at the labyrinth was the scroll of the word, before Varric's assassin had silenced him. They escaped through the ventilation shaft, pursued by the shouting knights, leaving the body of brother Elias to confirm their failure to Tierney and their defeat to Varric. As they rode hard out of Marseille, Kaelen felt a terrible weight settle upon him. He had lost his primary objective. Varric now knew they were heading to Sicily. The mission had changed from a strategic retrieval to a desperate race. Kaelen clutched the vellum map Tierney had provided. Though the Inquisitor had been a pawn, the map was real. "Sicily. We go now," Kaelen stated, his voice flat and hard. "Varric knows the location. It's a race to the labyrinth of the word. We can't rely on shadows anymore, Gareth. We have to be faster than their swords."
The narrow escape from Marseille left Kaelen with nothing but Tierney's stolen map, the Serpent's seal, and a burning conviction that the only way to beat Varric was to preempt his moves completely. The labyrinth of the word was their primary target, but Elias's dying words that the most critical text was the scroll of the word stirred a memory in Kaelen's mind, pointing not to Sicily, but back to France. The scroll of the word, the oldest and most radical Gnostic text, was not kept in an overseas library. Kaelen had personally overseen its transfer years ago from the Paris Templar compound. The safest, most secure hiding place in France, a place of profound symbolic importance and deep history, was the crypt beneath Chartres Cathedral. The logic was flawless. Varric was tracking Kaelen toward the Mediterranean, following the geographical cipher. If Kaelen could loop back, secure the scroll of the word from Chartres, and then race to the labyrinth, he would hold both the historical foundation and the philosophical culmination of the forbidden codes. The move was reckless, a desperate dash back into the king's territory, but necessary. Gareth was skeptical, but followed, driven now by a sense of professional obligation and an intense desire to pay back Varric for the loss of Elias. They traveled north, avoiding the major routes, relying on forged papers and Gareth's knowledge of the French peasantry. They reached Chartres under a full moon, the cathedral a majestic, towering shadow against the night sky, its famous blue-stained glass rendered black and impenetrable. Kaelen and Gareth descended into the vast, echoing crypt, a labyrinth of stone vaults and ancient tunnels. Kaelen quickly located the specific sealed vault beneath the chapel of Notre Dame sous terre, its entrance disguised as an early Roman sarcophagus. Inside, in a niche hewn deep into the bedrock, was a single silver cylindrical case, the scroll of the Word. Kaelen's heart hammered against his ribs. He had done it. Against all odds, he had secured the intellectual origin point of the entire Gnostic tradition the king sought to eradicate. "It is done," Kaelen whispered, feeling a profound relief as he grasped the silver scroll case. "We have the core. Now we leave France for good and head to Syracuse." Gareth stood near the mouth of the small vault, his face obscured by shadow. "We are not going to Syracuse, Kaelen." The words were spoken without emotion, yet they froze Kaelen instantly. He turned, the heavy silver scroll case in his hands. "What are you saying, Gareth?" Gareth stepped fully into the weak light filtering from the crypt's main hallway. His massive frame was tense, and his eyes, usually blazing with gruff loyalty, were hard and unreadable. He held his sword, insolence, pointed not at the door, but directly at Kaelen's chest. "You have done your part, Templar. You led me to the true codes, the ones your academic friends hid so well. The scroll of the Word belongs to the original keepers, the few who never submitted to Rome or the French crown." Kaelen felt a dizzying coldness spread through him. "You betrayed me? Who do you serve, Varric?" "Varric is a fool, a political puppet. I serve an older, purer cause. The true codes are not to be given to scholars like you, to be debated and catalogued. They're to be guarded by the warriors, the fundamentalists who never lost faith in the true divine power they represent." Kaelen confirmed his worst fear. He had been working for a third faction all along, an ultra-orthodox hidden remnant of the ancient orders, a group even Kaelen, the master of the library, hadn't realized was still active and organized. They believed the codes belonged to their iron fist, not to the intellectual stewardship of scholars. "The Hospitallers? Your old order? You let them chase me for 5 years? You set up the trap in Rhodes?" demanded Kaelen, staggering backward. "I was exiled for insolence, not ignorance," Gareth sneered. "I was recruited by the Sect of the Sword 3 years ago. We knew you, Latour, would prioritize the knowledge. We simply followed your trail from the moment you left Paris, letting Varric and Tierney do the heavy lifting. Thank you for collecting the scroll of the Word for us." Before Kaelen could react, Gareth moved with terrifying speed, slamming the flat of insolence into Kaelen's head. The force sent the scholar sprawling against the stone wall. The silver scroll case rolled out of Kaelen's numb grasp. Kaelen fought to clear his vision as he watched Gareth calmly retrieve the scroll of the Word. "Your part is done, scholar," Gareth stated, his voice now devoid of any shared history or warmth. "The scroll is ours. The Sect will use the cipher you carry to retrieve the Labyrinth archives next. I will tell them you died a hero fighting Varric's men." Gareth turned and vanished into the darkness of the crypt, leaving Kaelen alone, bleeding and betrayed. The realization was a crushing weight. He had not only failed to secure the most vital piece of the codes, but he had also unwittingly handed his enemy, a force more dangerous and fanatical than the king or Varric, the blueprint to the entire network. The betrayal at Chartres was complete. The focus of the hunt was no longer just survival. It was now a desperate war on 3 fronts, against the king's political machine, Varric's assassins, and now the fanatical, hidden Sect of the Sword. Kaelen was left for dead,
with nothing but the Serpent seal and the Inquisitor's map, the very tools that had led to his downfall.
Kaelen lay in the cold, dusty crypt beneath Chartres, the pain in his skull a dull, rhythmic hammer. The silver scroll case was gone, taken by the man he had trusted with his life. The betrayal by Gareth, the revelation of the fundamentalist sect of the sword, was a catastrophic blow that surpassed even the deaths in Paris and Marseille. Kaelen was alone again, but now he was wounded, hunted, and his enemies held the key to the codes. He managed to stagger out of the crypt before dawn, concealing himself in the quiet desperation of a dying village nearby. He didn't waste time on regret. He channeled his pain into a furious intellectual clarity. He still possessed two critical assets, the Serpent seal, containing the master cipher language, and Tyranny's map to the labyrinth of the word. Kaelen deduced the next moves of both his enemies. The sect of the sword, now possessing the scroll of the word, would race for the labyrinth in Syracuse, believing they would find the final complete archive there. Varric, knowing Kaelen was headed to Syracuse, thanks to the Elias trap, would deploy his forces to the same area. The labyrinth would be a slaughterhouse. Kaelen needed to find a different target, one that would not only provide a new crucial piece of the puzzle, but also revealed the true extent of King Philip IV's personal involvement in the hunt. He reviewed the Indigo Journal's final heavily coded passages, which spoke not of distant archives, but of a testament of the masters, a document that detailed the Order's finances and, more importantly, a list of every active, loyal member still clinging to the old ways. This testament was kept near the French capital, in the remote Cistercian monastery of La Trappe, disguised as a ledger of monastic donations. It was the king's primary objective, for it would give him the names he needed to complete the total eradication. Kaelen moved with renewed desperation, pushing himself toward La Trappe. He traveled by night, stealing food and water, his identity as a disgraced knight entirely stripped away. His suspicion of Philip's intense personal interest was confirmed when, while hiding near a royal supply road, he overheard a conversation between two high-ranking royal marshals. "The king's fury is absolute," one marshal reported grimly. "The Grand Master Varric has failed to capture the heretic Kaelen, and worse, has allowed the scroll of the word to fall into the hands of a dangerous splinter group, the Sect. Philip fears this sect, believing they hold the political capital to destabilize his authority." "And the last masters?" another asked. "The king has decreed an immediate transfer. The last of the old guard, 5 senior masters, are to be transported from the holding cell in Orleans to Paris for a swift, decisive execution before the sect can use them as bargaining chips. The king himself has signed the order. He is personally tracking Kaelen's movement through his own intelligence network." The realization hit Kaelen with stunning force. Philip wasn't just tracking the gold or the books. He was tracking Kaelen, believing him to be the key player. The king was using the threat of the sect to justify the immediate execution of the last loyal masters. Kaelen abandoned his plan to raid the testament at La Trappe. The survival of the last true masters, the men who held the Order's living history, was now paramount. He had to intercept the convoy. He raced towards Orleans, the city of the transport, finding a single moment of respite in a hidden forest clearing to make a desperate plan. He was one man, facing a royal convoy protected by a squadron of soldiers. He couldn't rescue the masters. He could only aim to intercept and retrieve the testament of the masters before Varric could. He managed to forge a royal order that allowed him to briefly infiltrate the Orleans compound before the convoy left. He slipped into the cell of the most senior master, Sir Hugh of Bordeaux, a man Kaelen had studied under years earlier. Hugh was resigned to his fate, sitting in the darkness, praying. "Master Hugh, it is Kaelen," he whispered urgently. "The testament, it is the real prize. The king's ledger. Does it contain anything besides the finances?" Hugh looked up,
his face gaunt but his eyes sharp. "The ledger is a decoy, Kaelen. The true testament, the key to our final sanctuary, is kept on a single ring, disguised as a wedding band, carried by the youngest master, Sir Antoine. It is a cipher, not a ledger. It contains the key to the Mediterranean sanctuary." Hugh reached through the bars and pressed a small, crude map drawn on a scrap of linen into Kaelen's hand. "Varric and the Sect will meet at the labyrinth, Kaelen, but the scroll of the word is meant to open the sanctuary, not the labyrinth. Save the ring, save Antoine, or at least retrieve the key." Kaelen had risked everything for a decoy ledger. He withdrew just as the convoy prepared to move. His mission shifted violently again. He had to stop the convoy, not for the testament, but for a single crucial ring, the key to the Order's true final refuge, a place that could save the forbidden codes from both the King's fury and the Sect's fanaticism. He had to confront the Royal Guard and Varric's executioners, a lone figure in the French countryside, for the fate of a hidden sanctuary.
Kaelen rode through the night, a phantom of fury and desperation. He was no longer trying to outwit Varric or the king. He was attempting to crash directly into their combined apparatus of power. Hugh of Bordeaux's map was clutched in his fist, leading him to the pre-dawn transport route outside Orleans. His objective? Sir Antoine, the youngest of the condemned masters, and the gold ring he wore, the cipher key to the Order's final, hidden sanctuary. Kaelen found the convoy precisely where Hugh's map predicted, a clearing in a dense oak forest, the morning mist hanging heavy and cold. The convoy consisted of 3 wagons and 24 heavily armed royal guards, reinforced by 4 Black Cross knights from Varric's unit, the same unit that killed Elias. It was an impossible fight for one man, but Kaelen didn't need victory, he needed distraction and speed. He dismounted 100 yards from the clearing, moving through the undergrowth. He pulled 3 small clay vessels from his pack, alchemical fire pots he had purchased in Marseille, and smashed them against the rear wagon, igniting a sudden hot fire fueled by the dry wood and oil. The explosion of flame and smoke was the distraction Kaelen needed. The royal guards immediately surged toward the burning wagon, shouting and scrambling to contain the blaze, believing they were under a massive ambush. But the 4 Black Cross knights, however, remained cold and disciplined. They knew this was a targeted strike. They immediately moved to secure the most valuable cargo, the masters held in the lead wagon. Kaelen intercepted them, emerging from the smoke like an avenging spirit. He engaged the lead Black Cross knight instantly, his short sword a blur of motion against the heavy 2-handed blade of his opponent. Kaelen was faster and smarter, compensating for his lack of strength with pure, desperate ferocity. He disarmed the first knight with a calculated strike to the wrist and drove his dagger into the throat of the knight before the knight could utter a sound. The remaining 3 knights fanned out, surrounding Kaelen. "The heretic!" one screamed, recognizing the scarred face. Kaelen fought with the singular focus of a man who had already lost everything. His entire world narrowed down to the clang of steel and the desperate need to reach the lead wagon. He parried a blow that would have cracked his ribs and lunged low, disabling one knight with a slash to the knee. But the sheer weight of the Templar armor and the discipline of the 2 remaining assassins proved too much. A crushing blow from a knight's sword struck Kaelen's shoulder, sending him staggering back, the pain an agonizing white light. The lead Black Cross knight, Sir Allard, stepped past Kaelen, moving to the prisoner wagon. "The king commands their immediate execution, now." Kaelen watched in horror as the knights began to pull the masters from the wagon. Sir Hugh, Sir Antoine, and 3 others were lined up in the damp clearing. Allard raised his sword for the final gruesome task. "No!" Kaelen roared, ignoring the crippling pain in his shoulder, and launched himself at Allard, tackling the knight just as the sword began its descent. The collision threw both men into the mud. Kaelen wrestled desperately, not for his life, but for the master's few remaining moments. Allard was stronger, fueled by zealotry, and quickly pinned Kaelen beneath him, the point of his dagger against Kaelen's eye. "The codes die with you, heretic," Allard hissed. Kaelen was defeated.
But in that same moment, a blinding flash of desperate motion occurred behind them. Sir Antoine, young and nimble, had exploited the chaos. He twisted free from the execution line and darted back to the wagon, pulling something small and metallic from the lining of his tunic. He ran towards Kaelen, but Allard, seeing the motion, shouted, "The key! Stop him!" Allard abandoned Kaelen and lunged at Antoine. Kaelen, freed, watched the tragic scene unfold. Antoine didn't stop. He threw the small gold ring, the sanctuary key, to Kaelen, tossing it high into the air. Allard's sword was faster than the throw. The blade met Antoine's chest with a sickening final thud. The young master fell, joining his brothers in the fate decreed by the king. Kaelen watched the gold ring glitter in the early sunlight as it spun through the air. He lunged, catching the ring just as the royal guards, finally organized, descended upon the scene. He had the key, but at the ultimate price. He had failed to save the men, but he had secured the final, pivotal piece of the forbidden codes. He had no time for grief. He turned and plunged into the surrounding forest, escaping the combined pursuit of the king's soldiers and Varric's fanatics. He left behind a scene of carnage, the burning wagon, the bodies of his fallen master and brothers, and the fury of a thwarted king. The gold ring was on his finger, disguised as an ordinary wedding band, warm against his skin. It was the master key, the final geographical cipher that bypassed all the known archives and led directly to the Order's ultimate, hidden fortress in the Mediterranean. The labyrinth of the word was irrelevant. Kaelen had the true destination. He now had all the components: the philosophical cipher, the location cipher, to Tierney's map to Syracuse, and the final key, Antoine's ring, that revealed the true, secret fortress. The labyrinth of the word was simply the rendezvous point, where the three armies, Kaelen, Varric, and the Sect, were destined to collide. The final confrontation was inevitable.
Kaelen knew the rendezvous point, Syracuse, Sicily. Tierney's map to the labyrinth of the word was the lure, drawing Varric's Black Cross and Gareth's Sect of the Sword to a predictable, contained location. Kaelen, however, possessed the true target, the gold ring on his finger, Sir Antoine's final gift, which contained the encrypted coordinates for the Order's hidden sanctuary. The ring cipher, which Kaelen decrypted on the grueling sea voyage to Sicily, pointed to a small, uninhabited island chain south of Crete, a place known only to the first Templar masters. This island held a massive, sealed fortress carved beneath the rock, designed to protect the Order's most forbidden texts from both fire and tide. Kaelen arrived in Syracuse and, without pausing, followed Tierney's map to the Roman cistern complex. He did not intend to enter the labyrinth. He intended to watch it burn. He arrived hours before dawn. The cistern was already surrounded. Varric had moved with typical speed, deploying a large contingent of Black Cross knights. But they were not alone. Moving in the dense shadows of the ruins was a separate, smaller force of brutal, unadorned men, the Sect of the Sword, led by Gareth. Kaelen concealed himself in a crumbling archway, watching the chaos unfold. The confrontation began not with a subtle maneuver, but with a shocking explosion of violence. Gareth and his Sect, driven by fanatic zeal and possessing the scroll of the word, charged Varric's Black Cross unit directly. They fought not for gold, but for the philosophical right to possess the archives. The sounds of clashing steel and screams filled the ruined cistern. Varric, dressed in full Templar armor, fought with the detached brutality of a politician-turned-general, directing his men to defend the entrance to the labyrinth, believing Kaelen or the scroll was inside. Kaelen used the distraction to slip away. He had no more time to spare. He hired a small, fast vessel, using the last of his coin and promising the captain triple the fare to sail to the coordinates revealed by Antoine's ring, the forgotten island sanctuary. He reached the barren, windswept island 36 hours later. The coordinates led to a sea cave, its mouth perpetually obscured by crashing waves. Using the cipher from the ring, Kaelen found the hidden mechanism, a pressure plate disguised as a natural stone formation, that opened the path.
The mechanism worked. The water level dropped, revealing a wide, dry passage leading deep into the bedrock. This was the true labyrinth, the arrest sanctuary of the Word. Kaelen moved into the silence. The fortress was enormous, carved with ancient precision. He reached the central archive chamber, a vast circular room lined floor to ceiling with sealed, lead-lined chests containing the complete foundational texts of the forbidden codes. The preservation was absolute. But the silence was short-lived. A sound echoed from the entrance tunnel, the unmistakable crunch of leather boots on stone. Someone had tracked him here, and they had arrived terrifyingly fast. It was Varric and Gareth, and they were alone. Varric, covered in dust and blood from the Syracuse battle, held the indigo journal Kaelen had dropped in Marseille. Gareth carried the silver scroll of the word case. They had battled through the labyrinth skirmish, and realizing the true objective was missing, had somehow joined forces to decipher the final location. "A simple cipher," Varric sneered, throwing the indigo journal at Kaelen's feet. "The old masters trusted you, Kaelen. They believed the scholar was the only one pure enough to guide the codes. They were wrong. You led us all here." "The betrayal of Chartres secured the scroll for the Sect," Kaelen noted, his gaze fixed on Gareth, whose face was a mixture of triumph and shame. "How did you convince Varric to follow you, traitor?" Gareth spoke, his voice heavy with fanaticism. "Varric realized that the codes are more dangerous in the hands of the king's fire than in the hands of the faithful. We made a temporary pact, the scroll of the word for the gold you betrayed him for." Varric stepped forward, drawing his sword. "The codes are the ultimate currency. I will not burn them for Philip. I will use them to build my own empire. The gold is irrelevant. I will lead the Sect, and with the sanctuary of the erased word, I will control the fate of Europe." The final confrontation began, a desperate three-way battle in the heart of the Forbidden Library. Varric fought with the brutality and calculated efficiency of the king's enforcer, aiming to kill Kaelen and seize the archives. Gareth fought with the wild, zealous fury of a man possessed, his goal to secure the knowledge for his own radical sect. Kaelen, fighting with the weight of the Order's history on his shoulders, dodged Varric's heavy swings and Gareth's wild attacks. Kaelen knew he could not defeat both physically. He had to sever the unholy alliance. Feigning an injury, Kaelen lunged at the sealed archives, grabbing a ceremonial Templar torch. "Varric, if you ignite the codes, Philip wins. If the Sect takes them, they will burn the world. Look." Kaelen pointed the torch at Varric, but then, with a devastating swiftness, he pivoted and drove the lit torch deep into the exposed muscular arm of Gareth. Gareth screamed, dropping the silver scroll case. The sight of Varric instinctively reaching for the fallen scroll, prioritizing the prize over his partner, was the final severance. "He betrays you, Gareth. He is only interested in the power. The codes are meant to be shared, not controlled by either a king or a fanatical warrior." Varric, momentarily distracted by Gareth's betrayal and the fallen scroll, was slow to react. Kaelen used the brief window, spinning and driving his short sword not at Varric's heart, but through his sword arm, disarming the Grand Master instantly. Varric collapsed, screaming, his dreams of a shadow empire shattered. Gareth, staring at the betrayed trust in Varric's eyes and his own burned arm, finally understood the depth of the corruption. "The codes are the only thing that matter, Gareth. Not the Order, not the Sect, the ideas," Kaelen pleaded. Gareth looked at the vast archives, then at the bloodied Varric, and finally at the silver scroll case. With a ragged sigh of ultimate defeat, he pushed the scroll case toward Kaelen with his foot. He had chosen the preservation of the codes over the victory of his sect. The three-way war was over. Kaelen stood alone, the undisputed, unwanted keeper of the forbidden codes.
Silence returned to the subterranean sanctuary of the erased word, a silence far heavier and more profound than the battle's violent chaos. Varric lay disarmed and bleeding, his dreams of power shattered against Kaelen's desperate strategy. Gareth, his arm burned and his fanaticism momentarily broken, stared at the massive archives, his face a complex mixture of defeat and dawning realization. Kaelen stood over the two vanquished knights, the victor by necessity, not by desire. He held the ceremonial torch, the light flickering over the thousands of scrolls, the accumulated wisdom, heresy, and occult science of the forbidden codes. The Templar Order's deepest secret was now in the hands of the scholar they had exiled. Varric, struggling to sit up, hissed, "Kill me, Latour. You have the power. You can rebuild. You can use these codes, rally the Sect, and take your revenge on Philip." Kaelen looked at Varric, then at the silver scroll of the word case. "You don't understand the codes, Varric. They are not a weapon. They are a philosophy of internal light. And the moment they become the foundation of a new order, a new institution of power, they become exactly the poison Philip claimed they were." He turned to Gareth, who was tending to his injury. The Sect of the Sword sought to control the light. Varric sought to monetize it. Philip sought to extinguish it. All three paths lead to the same destruction. Gareth looked up, his pale eyes searching Kaelen's face. "Then what was the fight for, scholar? Why did we risk everything to save these papers?" "To preserve the ideas," Kaelen stated simply. "The old world is dead, Gareth. The age of the militant, wealthy, centralized religious order is over. Philip IV has ensured that. If I try to resurrect the Templars or use these codes to create a new, secret church, we will simply relive the cycle of persecution and corruption." Kaelen walked to the nearest chest, running his hand over the lead casing. The codes were too dangerous, too radical, and too vast to be entrusted to a single institution, especially one built on the failures of the past. The true Templar legacy was not the cross, but the gnosis, the knowledge of self. He made his final, terrifying choice. He spent the next 2 days working feverishly. He did not burn the codes, nor did he begin to translate them. Instead, he used the final ciphers and the master geographical keys to create a new, intricate plan for their dispersal. He worked Varric, extracting information about the king's spy network, and used the terrified Varric as a source for logistics, promising him safe exile if he cooperated. Kaelen and Gareth worked together, loading a small portion of the most critical texts, including the scroll of the word, onto their small ship. The bulk of the archive, the vast majority of the texts, Kaelen decided, to leave exactly where it was, sealed deep beneath the Mediterranean rock, its existence known only to himself, Gareth, and the wounded Varric, who was now a prisoner of necessity. He addressed Varric one last time before leaving. "You will be given a small allowance in the east, far from France. If you ever reveal the location of this sanctuary, I will ensure Philip IV finds you first. Your freedom depends on your silence." Varric, humbled and broken, simply nodded. The true resolution came once Kaelen and Gareth reached the Italian mainland. Kaelen did not hand the codes to a new Grand Master or a rival pope. Instead, he began sending coded packages to a network of independent scholars, Sufi mystics, and Italian Renaissance thinkers, men and women who prized secular inquiry and were beyond the reach of the French king and the papal Inquisition. He broke the codes into their constituent parts, the mathematics to one group, the Hellenic philosophy to another, the ritual practices to a third, ensuring that no single person could ever possess the complete, dangerous truth. He was not creating a new order, but seeding the future, allowing the banned ideas to quietly re-enter the intellectual bloodstream of Europe, to rise again centuries later as the engine of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. Kaelen embraced his true identity, not a knight, but a librarian. He became the invisible chronicler, the shadow archivist. He parted ways with Gareth near Venice. Gareth, having witnessed the finality of the old world, pledged to use his martial skills to protect the burgeoning network of scholars Kaelen was establishing. He rode east, a redeemed warrior dedicated to the defense of ideas. Kaelen, discarding the Templar name and the scholar's pallor,
faded into the vibrant, dangerous anonymity of the Italian city-states. The forbidden codes were safe, not because they were guarded by swords or high walls, but because they were free. The institutional structure was erased, but the ideas were preserved, scattered like seeds across a thirsty continent. Kaelen vanished, becoming the whisper in the quiet corners of Europe, a master of secrets who chose to end the old world's power struggles by simply letting the light escape.